Hi, it's Scott Vogel on sex addiction. I'm going to share with you the 5 most common questions women ask about sex addiction. You and a lot of people don't realize that women too can suffer from sex addiction. It's a fact that the number of women who are seeking treatment for sex addiction is on the rise. The addiction itself is a very sensitive subject with men, but social norms make it even more challenging for women. Women have to overcome strong feelings of guilt and shame and embarrassment, and it can be very difficult for women who are struggling with a sex addiction and struggling in recovery. Therapists and ministers and other professionals have women coming to them with a wide range of problems and questions regarding their sex addiction. These are just the top 5 questions that most women ask. The first question is, why am I struggling with a sex addiction? You see, society tends to downplay the sexuality of women. However, women have sexual desires just like men. And when they're not using the sexual desires in a healthy way, they can become addicted to sex when it's used to comfort them rather than to satiate a healthy human sexual relationship. The causes of sex addiction are very complex. There are many. It varies from person to person. They're believed to be similar, though, to the causes of alcohol and drug addiction, where the addict seeks to take their negative emotions and feelings and find a way to make themselves feel better. And they do that by releasing the chemicals in the brain. Those chemicals release those feel-good feelings. They're the natural chemicals in the brain that allow the body to feel pleasure as a result of sexual activity, the same chemicals that help us feel good when we are supposed to eat and eat well. In some cases, women can become dependent on those chemicals, and they end up with a sexual compulsion. Women, like men, can also use sex as a coping mechanism. When they're struggling with things in their life to cope, they want to feel better, they want to feel loved, they want to feel important, and the release of those feel-good chemicals help them to achieve that. They can also use sex as a release and an escape from emotional duress like stress and depression or a spiritual emptiness. And the female addict a lot of times uses sexual activity to fill a void, and she then becomes dependent on it over time to get her needs met. The second most commonly asked question is, how do I tell if I just have a powerful sex drive, or is it in fact a real sex addiction? The main determinant of an addiction is the craving to repeatedly engage in sexual thoughts and activities regardless of the negative consequences. If a woman feels satisfied after engaging in sexual thoughts or activities, it's a normal reaction. However, if she's already thinking about the next time she's not being satisfied, she's on her way to an addiction. Another indicator of addiction is the need to escalate the intensity of the sexual behavior. It's not as complicated as it might seem to differentiate between a healthy sex drive and a sexual addiction. The healthy sex drive, normal reaction to engage in sexual thoughts and activities. But the addictive sexual behaviors are not being satisfied, having a craving, being obsessed, and escalating the behaviors to get more and more of a high or a rush out of it. The third question most commonly asked is, I love to masturbate. Does this mean I could be headed towards sex addiction? Well, masturbation is a common sexual activity. It doesn't necessarily mean that a woman has a sexual addiction simply because she enjoys masturbating. Men and women both often experience their first sexual activity through masturbation, usually during adolescence, and for many into adulthood, but it doesn't form into a sex addiction. Masturbation is said to be normal, healthy sexual activity. but when it becomes repeated compulsion, it can be a sign of sex addiction in both sexes. If the woman's life becomes too engaged in the repeated compulsion, if the life revolves around sexual fantasies, pornography, chats, masturbation, affairs, obsession, then that's when normal activity has crossed the line and now it becomes addiction. Question 4 is, how can I recover from sex addiction? Fortunately, recovery from sex addiction is possible. Its goal is to be sexually healthy. Sex addiction is treated much like drugs and alcohol, except with sex addiction, the goal is not abstinence, but again, a healthy lifestyle. Treatment options for sex addiction include individual therapy, couples therapy, group therapy, throughout the entire, now hear this, long and difficult recovery process to overcome the woman's feelings of extreme shame, guilt, and embarrassment as a result of her addiction. The support and understanding of loved ones throughout the recovery process is vital if she's to lead a healthy, balanced sex life. 12-step recovery programs are also a vital and key element in recovery from sex addiction. And question 5 is, I've pushed my significant other away as a result of my sex addiction. Is there a way to help them heal with me? Now, usually in a relationship where somebody is sexually addicted, the other person probably has a few issues. So there are many ways that you can help your partner recover from the trauma of being in a relationship with a sex addict. A partner might feel a lot of anger, confusion, isolation. They've become estranged often, and treatment programs will include the partner as a part of the overall recovery process. Couples therapy is important, as well as individual therapy, which will help the partner in their own recovery from the trauma. Realize the discovery of the sex addiction is traumatic to the spouse or the partner. And in some cases, the process can bring you closer to each other. COSA, C-O-S-A, is a 12-step recovery program for men and women whose lives have been affected by another person's compulsive sexual behavior. And the guilt that often comes with the trauma of the sexual addiction has to be dealt with by the person who is addicted and the other person who sometimes might feel responsible that they didn't do enough to help their partner. So why is a woman struggling with a sex addiction? Many different reasons why. It has a lot to do with using sex and the chemicals as a coping mechanism, as feel-good feelings. And do I have a sex addiction? When it becomes out of control, when it's affecting your life, when there's negative consequences and you have to intensify just to feel good, then it's a sex addiction. I love to masturbate. Does that mean I have a sex addiction? It only happens when it becomes abnormal, when the life begins to revolve around sex and fantasy and pornography and affairs and objectification. Normal masturbation is not a sex addiction. How can I recover from sex addiction? Treatment, group therapy, individual therapy, 12 steps. And can you save your relationships? Yes, if the partner is willing to work through and understand that it is a disease and that the anger and confusion, isolation that they've experienced can be dealt with therapy, with other programs, and even COSA, a 12-step program. Please visit our YouTube channel on sex addiction for more videos on sex addiction and recovery from sex addiction. Go to onsexaddiction.com for a free video explaining what sex addiction is, the 7 symptoms of sex addiction, the 4 traumas of sex addiction, the 4 faulty core beliefs set up by the traumas of sex addiction, and the solution to recovery from sex addiction, the 7 paths to success. You'll also find more information, articles, videos, and audios about sex addiction and sex addiction recovery. This is Scott Vogel on Sex Addiction.